In the summer of 1957, a real internal war broke out among the Soviet leadership. At first glance, everything seemed calm. The country was recovering after Stalin's death, and Khrushchev was gradually gaining influence. But behind the scenes, a real struggle began. Not with bayonets, but for the position of the party's top leader. At a meeting of the Presidium of the Central Committee, the majority voted against Khrushchev. It seemed that his career was over. He had lost. But then Khrushchev took a cunning step that no one expected. He declared that the question of his resignation should be decided not by a small circle, the Presidium, but by the entire Plenum of the Central Committee. That was about 130 people. Khrushchev insisted on a plenary session of the Central Committee, knowing that he would be supported there. And he was right. It was this decision that saved him from resignation and turned the whole game around. 2 years before the conspiracy, Khrushchev had appointed more than 200 people to key party positions in the republics, regions, and provinces. These people owed their careers to him, and they knew who to support at the critical moment. In this way, Khrushchev created the effect of popular support, even though most of his opponents were in Moscow. It was a victory not in the meeting room, but in the bureaucratic struggle. He showed that he had not only his chair behind him, but the whole country, the entire party base. The main members of the anti-party group were Vyacheslav Molotov, Lazar Kaganovich, and Georgy Malenkov. All three held high positions under Stalin and after his death. They saw Khrushchev as a threat to their influence and, most importantly, a threat to Stalin's legacy itself. Molotov was the most ardent opponent of the new course. He openly opposed criticism of Stalin and called him a great genius until the very end. He believed that Khrushchev's speeches at the 20th Congress were destroying the foundations of the party and undermining trust in the government. For Molotov, this was personal. After all, he himself had been Stalin's right-hand man for decades. Kaganovich was another of Stalin's comrades in arms. He was known as a tough manager who participated in collectivization, the construction of the metro, and repressions. He also saw Khrushchev's actions as a threat to the entire system in which he himself had grown up. Malenkov was younger but no less influential. After Stalin's death, he was the first to take the post of head of government. But he quickly lost influence, giving way to Khrushchev. He also wanted revenge. Interestingly, even Marshal Zhukov did not support Khrushchev at first, but sensing that Khrushchev would win, he abruptly switched sides. This move decided a lot. Zhukov's military weight was enormous. In essence, it was a conflict between the old Stalinist elite and the new generation of party leaders. The old guard wanted to preserve what they had created under Stalin. But times were changing, and although they had experience, connections, and power, they failed to understand one thing. The party had already begun to breathe differently. The Central Committee plenum lasted 3 days. It was not just a dispute between party members, it was a real political battle where the fate of the entire country was being decided. On one side were Molotov, Kaganovich, and Malenkov. These people who had ruled the USSR for decades sat at the table with a confident air. They believed that their experience and authority would prevail. On the other side was Khrushchev, who at first looked like a loser, but now went on the offensive, knowing that most of the Central Committee members were on his side. The plenum took place at the end of June 1957 and became a turning point. For the first time, there was an open discussion about who was worthy of ruling the country and who had already outlived their usefulness. These were not just boring party reports. Passions ran high, mutual accusations were made, tears were shed, threats were made, and political verdicts were handed down. Molotov, Kaganovich, and Malenkov, who just a few days earlier had tried to remove Khrushchev, were now forced to justify themselves before hundreds of party officials. They hoped to convince the Central Committee that they were right, but it was clear from the outset that the situation was against them, and they were beginning to lose control. One of the most difficult moments was Lazar Kaganovich's emotional breakdown. He stood up and said in a trembling voice, "I have given my whole life to the party." He did not ask for forgiveness, but it sounded like a farewell. He burst into tears right there at the meeting. But there was no sympathy. No one stood up for him. Not a single voice in the hall supported him. The people he had promoted for years remained silent. Molotov tried to remain firm. He said that he was acting in the interests of the party, that Khrushchev was leading the country into chaos. But in response, he heard something terrible. "Do you want us to remind you how many people were shot on your orders?" It was a direct threat. Molotov was given to understand that if he did not remain silent, his past, Stalin's repressions, would be used as a weapon against him. He also backed down. For 3 days, Khrushchev acted assertively but cautiously. He did not shout or humiliate anyone personally. He gave the floor to others, and they themselves tore the conspirators to pieces. The hardest thing for Molotov, Kaganovich, and Malenkov was not that they were accused, but that their former allies were now silent or openly opposed them. They found themselves isolated. The decision was taken by a majority vote. Molotov, Kaganovich, and Malenkov were expelled from the Presidium of the Central Committee. They remained members of the party but were removed from high politics. The plenum ended without applause, but with the complete defeat of the conspirators. Khrushchev's victory was not just a personal triumph, it was the collapse of the old Stalinist hierarchy. For the first time in the history of the USSR, it was not the person with the highest position and the most experience who won, but the one with the most loyal people below him. And this became a dangerous new trend. After the anti-party group was crushed at the Central Committee plenum, the fate of its members changed dramatically. It was not just a resignation, it was political destruction without bloodshed, but with complete removal from power. Khrushchev did not arrest them or stage show trials. He understood that times had changed. The Stalin era was over. But he decided to show that traitors would not be forgiven. All the key conspirators were quietly but harshly removed from high politics. Vyacheslav Molotov, former foreign minister and one of the most influential people during Stalin's time, was sent as ambassador to Mongolia. It looked like an honorary position, but in reality it was almost exile. From there, he could not influence party life or politics. He found himself on the periphery of events, and people tried not to mention his name anymore. The appointment to Mongolia was a real blow to Molotov. He did not even agree to it right away, but he had no choice. In 1962, he was finally removed from this position as well. Georgy Malenkov, who until recently had been the head of the USSR government, found himself as the director of a power plant in Ust-Kamenogorsk, Kazakhstan. In other words, the former leader of a huge country went to work at an enterprise in a remote region. It was not just a demotion, it was humiliation. Political exile under the guise of a transfer. Malenkov remained there until his retirement. Officially, he remained a member of the party, but he never again participated in high politics. Lazar Kaganovich, the oldest of the trio, was also removed from his posts and excluded from decision-making. They tried to dispose of him gently. They gave him the post of Deputy Minister of Industry. But a year later, he was removed from there as well. He lived for many more years, but all that time he was isolated from political life. The other members of the anti-party group, Shepilov, Bulganin, and others, were also gradually removed from high posts. Some ended up in the shadows, others in secondary positions. None of them ever returned to power. This was the first case in Soviet history when the elite was punished not with bullets, but with isolation and oblivion. But the humiliation was no less. After the plenum, Khrushchev further consolidated his power. Zhukov believed that he was now a reliable ally and the second man in the country. He actively promoted reforms in the army, expanded the role of the military, and traveled around the country and abroad, but in doing so, he sealed his own fate. Just 4 months after the plenum, in October 1957, Khrushchev removed Zhukov as well. Formally, it was for attempting to establish personal control over the army. In reality, Zhukov had become too independent and popular. Khrushchev did not like it when someone close to him became too powerful. Zhukov was removed from his post as Minister of Defense, expelled from the Politburo, and never returned to the government. He lived as a private citizen for the rest of his life, although he continued to be respected by the people. So there are no winners in this story. Zhukov helped Khrushchev defeat the conspiracy, but he himself became the next victim. Khrushchev was at the peak of his power. He had eliminated his rivals, subjugated the Central Committee, and silenced even giants such as Molotov and Zhukov. It seemed that no one could threaten him now, but it was at this moment that a new process began, the creation of enemies within the system, whom he did not notice or did not want to notice. He began to act abruptly, often on his own. Decisions were made without discussion, and criticism was almost never allowed. Those who had once helped Khrushchev began to feel that he trusted no one. Anyone who expressed doubt or offered an alternative fell out of favor. According to declassified data, immediately after the conspiracy was crushed, covert surveillance of high-ranking officials began. Every member of the Politburo and the Council of Ministers was placed under surveillance. Correspondence, meetings, trips, everything was monitored. Khrushchev began to see enemies even where there were none. He no longer relied on those around him, only on himself and a small circle of trusted people. In 1964, just 7 years later, the same people who had saved Khrushchev in 1957 staged a soft coup against him. There were no shots fired, no public scandals. They simply convened a meeting at which he was accused of voluntarism, rudeness, and inconsistency, and removed from all his posts. He did not resist. He was simply presented with a fait accompli. The man who had defeated the conspiracy became a victim of the conspiracy. The paradox is that Khrushchev lost not because he became weaker, but because he believed too much in his own infallibility and alienated everyone who could have been his ally. He himself raised a generation of officials who were accustomed to keeping quiet, waiting, and striking at the right moment.